time is your most valuable resource. You will be cash strapped as a startup, and it will feel like cash is your most valuable resource, but it's actually time. And there's just not enough hours in the day. The team is small, so collectively there's still not enough hours in the day, and
Yep.
you got to stay focused.
A few weeks ago, I was working with a client to finish up their new manager development program. And we were working on the final section, which is always on goal setting. And this is always the trickiest section for a new manager development program because every organization does goal setting differently. They all have different messages and different things that they want to focus on. For this particular organization, the thing that they wanted to focus on was teaching managers how to help their team prioritize. When you're a company, especially a startup, trying to move really quickly, often the things you choose not to do are just as important as the things that you choose to do. On this week's episode of the Leadership Launchpad, I am excited to welcome Dan Ceperley. Dan is the co-founder and COO of LeoLabs, a private company that tracks objects in low Earth orbit to help protect satellites and ensure the safety of space operations. When your company sells information about objects in orbit, you kind of have to have a global scale in order to have a product at all. That means building and operating tracking stations all around the world. And in order to move quickly, Dan and his team had to stay laser focused on their mission and not get distracted. This conversation covers a lot of ground, and you can expect to learn the role of leaders in helping their teams stay focused and not get distracted, the difficulty of shifting from doing to leading, and the importance of learning how to simplify information when you are communicating. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to remind you that if this is your first time listening to the show, please make sure you subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And if you happen to be someone who's responsible for developing leaders in your organization, then I would love to talk to you. If you need some help, please reach out to matt@bettereverydaystudios.com, and we can see what Better Everyday Studios can do to help build better leaders in your organization. With that, let's get into the conversation with Dan Ceperley. Dan, welcome to the Leadership Launchpad. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Matt?
I'm doing excellent. This is going to be a fun conversation. I already know. I've been in and around the space world for a really long time. It's been a large passion of mine, but I'm sure a lot of our listeners may not be as familiar with this. If you could describe what is space situational awareness, and how does LeoLabs fit into that?
Yeah, space situational awareness is basically making sure you understand everything that's going on in space. And so there are now over 10,000 satellites operating in low Earth orbit. There's a lot of debris in orbit, and there's a huge number of launches these days, just a lot more satellites going up into orbit. And then add on top of all of that, the technology is just getting better and better. So they're getting more nimble, they're doing more interesting things, and it just becomes really difficult to stay on top of everything that's happening in space.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but because I was at Vandenberg, what was Vandenberg Air Force Base, now Space Force Base for a long time. And forever, space situational awareness has been an exclusively government domain. Is that right? Like it was the government kind of doing it, and private companies like yourself is relatively new.
Oh, absolutely. We're kind of in the first wave of private actors really playing a big role. And even LeoLabs effectively came out of government programs. So starting back in 2009, I was at a research lab, SRI International, that was working on an Air Force Space Command contract and then later a DARPA contract, trying to figure out how to better track all these innovative new satellites. The fear was these new low-cost CubeSats were going to go into orbit in such numbers, they were going to darken the skies, and the space surveillance network couldn't keep up. So we were looking at commercial sensors, academic sensors, scientific sensors. How can we bring those to bear relatively quickly, on a much faster timeline than might be traditionally taken to build a space telescope or a space radar.
Yeah.
And so after about 8 years of research, we said, oh, we got the tech, but it needs to be operational. The tech we were playing around with, the scientists want to do science most of the day,
Of course.
and
Of course.
so it was like, you can't do space situational awareness as a part-time job. So let's build some hardware to make it happen. And so we raised some venture capital, spun the company out of that research lab, and since 2016 have been a standalone company, just building out a global network of radars for the purpose of delivering space situational intelligence, or actually we now call it orbital intelligence for the globe, for all commercial satellite
Oh, okay.
operators, government space agencies, and the like.
Excellent. Excellent. I want to touch on that kind of that network that you're building really quickly, but before we get there, I do want to ask the question for you, because I think most people, even if they don't know what space situational awareness is, or space intelligence, they've seen those maps of space and all the satellites that are surrounding the Earth, and everybody's freaking out. Oh my gosh, it's getting so crowded. And I think years ago, I remember Elon Musk specifically talking about it, because I think they were getting ready to launch the first version of the Starlink satellites, like the original test version. It was like the size of a fridge. And so, I can't remember if it was Elon or somebody else, but they made the comment of just like, okay, we're going to put up 40,000 of these. Imagine if you had 40,000 refrigerators spread over the entire surface of the Earth. Like, you could wander around your entire life and never find a refrigerator. Like there's just a lot of space, and it was a way of describing how much space there is. But they're also moving really fast. So I guess, just to kind of ask you from your point of view right now, with all these, with the huge number of launches that we're doing, especially in low Earth orbit, like how crowded is it getting, really?
So this is an active topic of debate across the
Yeah.
industry. And
Yeah.
to your point about things moving quickly, I'd note that the average closing speed in low Earth orbit is 12 kilometers per second.
Yeah.
So many times faster than a speeding bullet. And
Yes.
so if you even clip another satellite, or you get hit
You're
with a
done.
small piece of debris, you're done, you're
Yeah.
smashed.
Yeah.
And then the debris, it keeps going, it doesn't fall
Yeah.
out of orbit. So you're just left with, it's like you've got more trash speeding down the highway. So
Yeah.
my contention would be, I don't think we are near the limit of what we can put in low Earth orbit, as long as we have much better organizational technology. There's more and more
Ah.
concerns about, like, hey, if I'm launching a satellite, I got to wait for a window, a really clear window, to
Okay.
get a rocket up into orbit. Well, there are windows. The problem is the turnaround time to go from assessing it to planning it to getting paperwork filed and approved can be long. This can be
Yeah.
days. And by that
Yeah.
point, your predictions can be bad. It's kind of like predicting the weather in a sense. Space weather actually pushes the debris around a little bit, so you can have
Yeah.
out of date predictions. Or if you've got a launch scrub, you need to roll back a day or so, then you got to scramble and redo all of that. And with modern technology, it shouldn't have to be that big of a problem. The one other issue I'd point to is there's also not close coordination between all the actors. So there's
Yeah.
various countries and companies that aren't sharing their plans, where the satellites are going. So it's kind of like you're driving down the freeway and you can't see other people's turn signals. You've got no idea if they're even obeying the same traffic laws as you, and yet you're supposed
Yeah.
to be speeding along the freeway, kind of working with them. And so there's a big push to
Yeah.
to update that. And I'd say, LeoLab's role in all this is we're trying to be that independent source of information. We've got
Yeah.
this network of 7 radar sites around the world, continually watching low Earth orbit and producing data that's now relied upon by many satellites, many different government space agencies, US and the allies, to get kind of independent confirmation. Even if I'm not in direct coordination with these other satellites, at least I can know what they're doing or get
Yeah.
alerted about surprises that
Yeah.
might be coming up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, to put it in kind of aviation terms, it's like, and how busy is an airport? Well, it's a totally different game when you have air traffic controllers and a control tower versus if you don't. And if every plane was just on their own, kind of doing their thing, then you're not going to be able to support very many takeoffs and landings. But as long as you have those structures in place that people like you are trying to provide, you can suddenly do a whole lot more in the same volume. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah. So go into that site network, of radar stations that you've set up, and kind of the things that you're doing all across the globe, because there is a critical mass that you need for your information to even be valuable. Switching into kind of the more the topic of this episode, the leadership lens through which that has happened. You've expanded really quickly. You've set all this up really, really quickly. From your point of view, having seen it, how much was, because I think I'm always trying to get this question out to a lot of different companies that are successful, of just like, is it just like grit and hard work, or is it working smarter, or how does leadership play in? So from when you're looking at it, where was leadership's role in enabling the rapid expansion that you've been able to have?
Yeah, so especially in the early days for us, it was kind of stepping out into the unknown, or stepping out against the narrative that was in the industry,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of in a few ways. Probably the biggest was, back in 2016 when we started, all of these changes in low Earth orbit hadn't happened.
Yeah.
Mega constellations weren't a thing.
Yeah.
Reusable rockets weren't a thing. I don't even think the commercial crew was,
Yeah.
programmed to the International Space Station was a thing at that point. And but CubeSats were a thing, and we
Yeah.
said, well, the numbers are growing, and they're growing in low Earth orbit, and there's so much money and so much effort going into things like mega constellations, and also look at SpaceX. Given their track record, I'm going to bet that they're going to reuse rockets.
Something. Yeah.
It's that's the horse I bet on. Um, so we said, hey, low Earth orbit is really where all the change is going to be. So, as a business, as a startup, you want to go where the disruption is and where the growth is, because that's where the opportunity was. Um, but at the time, most of the discussion around the industry, especially if you got over to the defense side, was more geo. The problem is out at geo, and there were a bunch of people with telescopes, which are really good for geo, who were talking about the geo problem, and nobody else had radars. And so we were the only ones who could really
Yeah.
do radar for low Earth orbit. And so I remember so many panels I was sitting on where it was like five people who wanted to talk about geo and telescopes, and me wanting to talk about LEO and radars. And it was just a big part of it was kind of staying the course and just continuing to talk about it,
Yeah.
continuing to talk about it, continuing
Yeah.
to talk about it, and then also building. The other big thing, the reason we started LeoLabs was, we didn't want to spend a career on a single project, like a single radar. And maybe hubris, but we were like, we can do this better. And so just step out of
I like
the
it. I like it.
traditional avenues, raise the venture capital, go build the radars. And we did. And actually, we're now by far the industry leading data source for low Earth orbit. But in the beginning, it was counter to the common narrative.
Was there any times you mentioned staying focused, and I think that's a big thing. That's a big role of leaders, kind of at every level. Certainly at the top, but even at the bottom, it's just like really figuring out like what are the important things and keeping your team focused on the important things. You mentioned you were that outlier voice, kind of thinking about the other things. Were there potential distractions or times where you kind of be like, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to do that thing. Were there opportunities where you could have been distracted and not have been successful, where the vision really had to be like honed?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, huge numbers of distractions. And in fact, some of the best advice I ever got was from a few of our early advisors. So I got it from many people. So obviously, a lot of people have been burned by this, but they said, um, time is your most valuable resource. You will be cash strapped as a startup, and it will feel like cash is your most valuable resource, but it's actually time. And there's just not enough hours in the day. The team is small, so collectively there's still not enough hours in the day, and
Yep.
you got to stay focused. And yes, there's a ton of distractions. I mean, there's all sorts of. We came out of the research and development world. I'm a PhD electrical engineer.
Yeah.
Most of my founders were too. We like research. There's a lot of interesting research projects to work on. Unfortunately,
Always.
very few of them directly apply to your specific business model and what you specifically are setting out to build. And
Yeah.
you have to make the conscious decision. Yeah, we're not going to do that, or we're not going
Yeah.
to do it now. When we're
Yeah.
larger and more established, we can come back and do it. Um,
Yeah.
there's also lots of little partnerships you can do,
Yeah.
And I had to tell our team, and collectively we decided many times, we're like, yeah, we want to grow the industry. We want to be good partners to startups, and we want to be good partners to researchers and all this. But if we do that right in the beginning, we're not going to help anybody. The company is
Yep.
just going to crater, and it's not going to be a force for good. So we're going to have to ignore it for a while. And then when we're
Yep.
established and we're a much bigger company, and we've got all these really great capabilities, and then we can come back to all of that, and we can
Yeah.
help do all those things we wanted to do.
I love that phrase that you use, the not right now. There, because there's endless good ideas out there, and deciding not to do something doesn't mean you're saying it's a bad idea. It's just not something that you can afford to do right now, because as you said, time is the ultimate resource, and so you just have to be laser focused on kind of what you're doing. You mentioned kind of how you got started. I remember, if I remember correctly, when we first talked a few weeks ago, you mentioned that when you became a leader, you were kind of chosen to be kind of a bridge between a couple different groups. Am I
Oh
remembering
yes.
that correctly? How did you first get started as a leader?
Oh yeah. That way. In hindsight, I got lucky. One of those. It's good to
Yeah.
be good, and it's
Yeah.
good to be partially
Yes.
good and partially lucky. Well, this is probably
Yes.
a little more the luck category. But yeah, the so when I started at SRI International, they were working on this project to test the Allen Telescope Array, a scientific instrument
Yep.
for satellite tracking. And
Yep.
they got to use the instrument part time, and the scientists, of course, were going to continue to use it for science. But it was a bit of a culture clash. So there was the researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, and then also the SETI Institute, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They're doing their science mission, and then there's Air Force Space Command, which wants to test this out for satellite tracking. And well, the scientists are great at doing science, but these science projects, they don't have heavy management. It's a few principal investigators. They run at it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they produce good results. But it takes time. There's all sorts of course corrections. It's a very fluid environment. Air Force Space Command, I guess, as you know, much more rigorous, a lot heavier
A little bit.
management,
A
and
little bit.
so those cultures just clashed. And on both sides, lots of great intentions. It's just difference in culture. And so yeah, so I was fresh out of UC Berkeley, a grad student. So I was kind of loosely affiliated with the people who had the science side, and I'd gone to work for SRI International, the defense side. And so SRI put me in as the project manager. Later on, I figured out because it was, well, maybe this guy can sort it out, and he's got a foot in
Yeah.
both worlds. And
Yeah.
I like to think it went pretty well, but it was certainly learning to swim by just jumping into the deep end and trying it. So
Yeah, I mean, when you think back to that time, what were some of the early lessons that you had to kind of learn, or things you had to figure out as you got thrown into the deep end?
yeah, so as an engineer, probably the toughest transition was to shift from kind of doing everything or doing a lot of it myself, the technical work, over to my primary focus being on communications and focus, back to focus, and then also uh, trying to project managing. So making sure the project was progressing, we were hitting milestones, we were reporting things like that. Um, One other interesting thing was also just the translation, and maybe this is where leadership in kind of a management technical role, there's something interesting. But there were a lot of really good scientists who knew this big radio frequency system in great detail, um, but they couldn't simplify what they said, what they were saying, and they couldn't extract the
Yeah.
main messages
Yeah.
for people who weren't experts. And in hindsight, that was really good training for me. It served me really well in my career, but I had to explain it, and I was coming from the engineering side, so it took me forever to explain things in a simple form. And I remember I would make slides that I thought were simplified in presentations. I bring them up to my boss, like, no, go back to the drawing board. It's like, you got like 50 slides isn't going to work. You got three. Like, to take this
Yeah.
down to three. And as an engineer, you're like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to
Yes.
communicate anything reasonable? But
Yeah.
you're interfacing with senior decision makers and acquisitions folks and operators, and they don't have all day. You've got your special
Yeah.
program that you're immersed in, but they got 100 others, so they're going to have 30 minutes with you like once a month. You better be focused when you communicate with them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I can't tell you how often, kind of just going through a couple points of your answer there. I can't tell you how often this idea of, especially as an engineer, making that shift from doing it all yourself to kind of being more of the organizer and the communicator, and just how challenging that shift is. But it is interesting what you're talking about this simplification of messaging. I don't know if that's really come up, but it is in terms of the discussions in the podcast. But it is something that's coming up again and again in clients that I'm working with. Even something as simple as, look, we need to train our engineers how to build their slide decks for the executive team,
Yes.
right? Because they're just including too much information. And it sounds like for you, it was a lot of trial and error. It was just kind of iteration. You just
Oh
kind
yeah.
of kept running up against it again and again.
You know, yes. And frankly, I haven't found any better way to do it. Like you just have to
Yeah.
be persistent. And
Mm-hmm.
it's really, you got to be open to feedback too. Like you
Yeah.
got to listen. And often the feedback comes across in pretty negative terms. But if you
Mm.
can just,
Hmm.
relax and take the emotion out of it, there's a lot to learn every time you get swatted aside because, it's too detailed.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then ultimately, the ultimate simplification was pitching investors for the company.
Yeah.
Like,
I bet.
you know, you not only do
I
you
bet.
have just a few slides, you've got a 30
Yes.
seconds to get your message across, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the technical management was good prep for that.
Yeah.
One other thing I might say, patience is really important when shifting from being an engineer over to being more of a manager, because at least the
Hmm.
challenge for me is you get faced with some challenge and the instinct is to do it yourself. And you're like, I can do it myself. But then if you
Yeah.
ask somebody else to do it, they can't do it in an instant. And you're kind
Yeah.
of sitting there trying to hold yourself back saying, I should just dive into this and get it done and I'll get it done faster. But in reality, you might not necessarily get it done faster. What you're really trying to force upon yourself is the patience to just give that person time. Like maybe they need a few hours, maybe they need a few days, maybe they need a few weeks. You're
Yeah.
just going to have to give them the task and then trust them to get it done. And
Yeah.
you need to stay in touch with them. You need to communicate, but just having that patience, at least for me personally, was tough.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel you there. And I think that patience can go everything from, like you said, you have a challenge and you want to just like get it done, to even just kind of sitting in a meeting and like sitting on your hands
Yes,
and just kind of like, I'm just gonna, I have something to say, but I'm just not going to. I'm just gonna let my team
yes,
talk it out.
yes, absolutely. And yeah, and once you get good at it, you can really spot that. Yeah, actually, there's a lot of stuff going on. A lot
Yeah.
of good things going on, and then
Yeah.
you can also spot when the patience isn't warranted. There's certainly plenty of
Yeah.
times where it's nope, don't be patient, be very vocal, partially dive in yourself, but at least in the beginning, I had to let the pendulum swing too far towards the
Yeah.
patient side, like force myself to
Yeah.
be patient so I learn it, and then you can be more precise when you dial it in and the pendulum swings back.
Yeah. So how do you see that now? Because I think, so if we think about that, when you first start out, the impulse is to be on one side of that pendulum and say like, "Oh, I'm going to do it now. I'm going to give the answer. I have the good idea. I'm going to solve the problem." And then for you, you had to develop it, swing to that other side of, I'm going to maybe wait too long. How do you think about finding the balance? How do you judge whether you're being too patient or not? When are the times where it makes sense to just get your hands dirty and do it yourself, or give your own answer?
Yeah, and I'd say a fair amount of it at this point is kind of instinct, but there's
Yeah.
things like if there's if there really is a short deadline or a high profile deadline coming up,
Mm-hmm.
that just it goes to the top of my priority queue, which means I'm going to stay more on top of it.
Yeah.
There's also many things where it's like I have to be the one presenting it, or I have to be the one, defending it in a meeting, in which case I've really got to very thoroughly understand it, and that warrants a lot more kind of hands-on.
Yeah.
And then in other cases, especially where you've got teams that have worked together for a while, or leaders that have proven themselves repeatedly, it's pretty straightforward to just be hands off. You're like, all right, I know this is right up their alley. Let them take it.
Yeah.
Let them run with it. And then for the big gray zone cases where it's like, hey, this is something new, or it's a new mixture of people, or it's kind of an unknown priority, um, then it's just, I find a lot of frequent conversations, and the team meetings are good, but I also err on the side of kind of extra one-on-one or small meetings just to check in, because that's where you detect the where are the roadblocks that aren't being surfaced,
Yeah.
or kind of or can you find an unspoken kind of bias that is steering the project aside. Uh,
Yeah.
and so, um, but yeah, I don't have a single solution for it
Of
all
course.
beyond the library of like just raw experience.
Yeah, it's super situational. Depends on, yeah, the individual project and the deadlines, the person you're dealing with. Yeah, what your relationship is like. I'm sure there's endless varieties for how to come to that conclusion. So we've talked a bit about a lot of different qualities that have kind of come up with in terms of how you see your role as a leader. Of, you got to have a certain level of patience. There's a lot of communication. There's distilling of information. As a person kind of at the top looking down at LeoLabs, when you think about leaders in your organization and some of the managers, closer to the work maybe, what do you see as the primary thing that you're looking for them? What's the primary role of, first time or frontline managers in technical organizations?
Yeah, at least for us, the thing we focus on first is moving people over to lead small technical projects, or I should say, small technical teams. The project can
Okay.
often be quite large or quite challenging, but
Yeah.
start them out with a small team, generally with people they know, because then it sets them up for success. It's kind of an environment where they can still be doing a fair amount of it. So you don't have
Yep.
to fight, at least for me, you don't have to fight the patience battle all the way to
Mm-hmm.
conclusion
Mm-hmm.
right away. But set them up for that.
Mm-hmm.
Or also if it's a very clear outcome or a very clear priority, like it's a high priority project, it's got to get done. This is the outcome. There's something clear for them to drive at. It's a good place for them to start because a lot of the
Mm.
organizational barriers fall down, because everyone around them
Yeah.
understands the priority and understands the timeline, and will generally take down the barriers. If it's more speculative or it doesn't appear to be high priority, that sort of thing, that's where all the bureaucratic hurdles kind of bubble up and crop up.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of setting somebody up for a position. There's so many different levels or layers to what it means to be a leader, and yeah, some of it's the kind of like the political stuff of figuring out you're making sure you're getting things. Sometimes it's clarifying the message. Sometimes it's getting to know people, and so you know it's like giving in somebody's first leadership role, you don't necessarily want to throw them into a position where they have to fight all of those fights at once, where they have to build trust with the team. They have to figure out what the whole point of the project is. They have to struggle for resources in order to complete the project. It's like, let's get rid of a couple of those and just give them kind of a softball initially.
yeah, in a sense, give them a softball, and for the people who do really well, you can kind of rapidly level them up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also it's good feedback because generally everyone they'll do well on a few aspects and maybe not on a few. And so then that
Mm-hmm.
enables
Mm-hmm.
them and
Mm-hmm.
you as the manager to get a more clear view of, oh, okay, how's this person going to succeed, or where can we invest some time to help
Yeah.
them level up?
Yeah. I mean, as a final note, kind of on that piece about feedback, because this has come up a little bit, it's leadership is very situational. The clarifying a message is very, it's about just like having a lot of at bats where you just trial and
Yeah.
error it, but then you got to be able to have feedback. For you yourself, how did you have you always been good at receiving feedback, or did you have to kind of are there any techniques that you kind of created for yourself, or that you tips that you give to other people to accept that feedback without it destroying them, or taking it too personally?
Yeah. Um, I was trying to think in the moment if I've always been good at receiving feedback. I don't know. Probably mixed. But
Yeah.
I had a few projects along the way where just they were kind of tougher management environments. So I
Mm-hmm.
had kind of just trial by fire gone through a few where the feedback was tough, and at one of the things that those very quickly taught me is it often isn't personal. I'm taking the brunt of all
Yeah.
of this, but
Yeah.
it's actually all these other things going on, that,
Yeah.
and there's
Yeah.
only a nugget of that is truly directed at me. But so it
Yeah.
kind of, that experience was good. So maybe I'd encourage everybody, don't shy away from necessarily the difficult situations. You get a lot of learning out of those situations.
Yeah.
In the moment, they're tough, but
Yeah.
the silver lining is you get a lot of good feedback. The thing that helped me, especially early in the company when I was fundraising,
Yeah.
was to think through both outcomes. So I pitch an investor, then generally you wait a few days for some feedback, and then you come up on that next phone call, and thinking through, all right, if they say yes, how am I going to take it? And if they say no, how am I going to take it?
Mm.
And the obvious thing to do is to think through yes, because
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah, I'm going to get the money, I'm going to go off and bring these other
Mm.
investors in, and I'm going to close the round and build the business. Great. Um, but when you're pitching, 99% of the time the answer is no. So you're
Yeah.
going to get a
Yeah.
lot more no's.
Yeah.
And so thinking through just I would write down a few questions, like what would I want to know? Like I have suspicions about why they would say no. Can I get those validated so I can
Mm.
improve the pitch? And I remember a few times, so I made a point of telling the investor right after they said no, I said, thank you. It was really helpful to get a quick turnaround, because both of our time's valuable, and I appreciate you coming back to me fast. And if I might ask, it would help me to understand what was wrong with the pitch. And I remember a few investors just made the comment. They said, "Oh wow, we've never had anybody actually just ask us for
Wow. Really?
feedback in
Wow.
probably in a non-confrontational way. Ask us for feedback." And
Sure. Yeah.
generally they would take a few more minutes. So they might take 5 minutes and they might run you through a few points. They'd never go
Yep.
through in great detail, but at least they'd give you the categories.
Yeah.
Maybe it was the technology didn't connect or the market size didn't connect or
Yeah.
something in the financial model didn't connect. And it was always really useful. And then I think it also helps you just build up a reputation, so
Yeah.
then you're going to see them later. There's not all that many investors. And so, they remember you as somebody reasonable to talk to. So it
Yeah.
keeps the door open.
I love that tip so much. I think, when we talk about one of the things that comes up a lot in getting better at receiving feedback is curiosity. And so what you're talking about is really like front loading or pre-planning your curiosity, so that you're not in the moment just trying, grasping for straws of, oh, what should I ask? And so, that can apply to, you're getting ready for your annual review and just think through, okay, so if I don't get my bonus or I get a lower rating than I expected from my boss, what am I going to ask them? And and so it almost allows you to short circuit your emotional reaction in the moment with this other question that helps you react better in the moment. It sets a standard for you where people now see you as somebody who's genuinely asking for it, and it gives you information that you can then get better at. So that is such a fantastic tip. I love it. Yeah, I think we got to end on that. That's been awesome. That's awesome, Dan. This is a great discussion. Thank you so much for being here today, Dan.
Oh, well, it's an absolute pleasure, Matt. I really appreciate it. And I hope some of this will be helpful to a lot of people out there.
Yeah, I think it definitely will. We covered a lot of ground, everything from, how important it is for a leader to maintain focus of their teams because as you said, time is the ultimate resource that you have to be concerned about. And so the best way to conserve your time is by being really clear on what you focus on. For engineers, transitioning over, for anybody, any leader, it's really important to think about patience and kind of what that means, and then this last point about how to get more feedback so we can all improve because everything is so situational. This has been fantastic. I'm sure people will get a lot out of it, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
That sounds great. Me too.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.